Today's meeting is called In Defence of Leninism, and it's Charlie Kimber, so I'll pass him over straight away.
Well, thanks to everyone for coming. Let's hope we can have some proper discussion around it. The context of the talk is, I suppose, twofold. The least important, in general terms, is the arguments inside the party over the last few months, which I'm not going to go through in this talk, which you'll be pleased to know, except in the sense that everything that we talk about in terms of Lenin and party organisation and so on touches upon some of the arguments that have been raised since last winter. The most important reason for having it is because of the real questions posed in the world at the moment about how we can organise to defeat the austerity programme, and more than that, to fight for a socialist future. And these are posed very starkly. If you think just over the last 12 months, the experience of the Egyptian revolution, the extraordinary achievements both of workers in the factories and of the people who filled Tahrir Square and the other streets of Egypt in bringing down the dictator Mubarak. Incredible achievement. But the reality is that in Egypt today, workers still face a regime of extreme exploitation and oppression. Women's rights are still denied. There is still a complete lack of genuine social transformation. People are poor and don't have even the most basic requirements of life. That's true. If you look at the achievements of the Occupy movement, which spread across the globe, the slogans of "We are the 99%", the sense of struggle against the 1%, incredibly important, touched a real chord across many parts of the world, and yet the Occupy movement has largely slipped away and has not left behind an enduring legacy of organisation and activity. In most cases, you can argue about it, but that's the regrettable truth. If you think about the Indignados movement in Spain, incredibly important, filling the squares of Madrid and Barcelona and so on, merging at various points with the workers' movement, the idea of bringing together the energy and enthusiasm of people on the streets and the power of workers in the factories. It hasn't gone away, still remains important, still has an echo in, for example, very important campaigns against evictions that are taking place in the Spanish state at the moment. Some quite interesting lessons for our own struggle against the bedroom tax. But nonetheless, the Indignados movement has been pulled downwards from the high points of resistance. And really what all of these pose is, how do revolutionaries organise? And I suppose I want to argue that Lenin and the ideas of Lenin, although they can't be simply patched onto 2013 in Britain, are crucial to how we think people should organise and how we can win. So that's what this is about. There isn't a single set of ideas which you can say, here is Leninism and I'm going to defend it. Because if I were to patch down a set of ideas that you can pull from one particular set of writings by Lenin, you would be able to say, but at a different time he said something different, didn't he? And you'd be right about that. But there are some important basic notions. Lukács, who was a Hungarian revolutionary, ended up as a Stalinist hack, but he was a very important revolutionary in the 1920s, put it like this: the actuality of revolution, this is the core of Lenin's thought and his decisive link with Marxism. In this sense, as both the objective basis of the whole epoch and the key to an understanding of it, the proletarian revolution constitutes the living core of Marxism. The actuality of revolution, in 4 words, is expressed a vast range of ideas. What really are, there's 2 things that I think are important about it. The first is the understanding through everything that Lenin writes that whatever particular struggle people are involved in, it's not simply about the particular struggle in which we're involved that revolutionaries have to be concerned. So in a trade union struggle for wages, conditions, jobs, or whatever it may be, in the struggle over the bedroom tax, in the struggle against fascism. These are all very important struggles, but there also has to be something else that we're simultaneously seeking to build at the same time. And that is a recognition that in the modern world, nothing fundamentally can be solved without approaching the question of the political power of the working class and the abolition of capitalism. That doesn't mean, by the way, that at every meeting all that we need to do is to repeat the fact, comrades, without a revolution, your campaign is useless. That would be a foolish approach. It would be wrong as well, by the way. We can, for example, beat the bedroom tax without having a proletarian revolution, thank goodness. You can win a 5% wage claim without proletarian revolution. That's true. It means something more fundamental than that. It means thinking about how at the same time as building around any particular campaign, we are also building the muscles and sinews of a movement that can begin to approach that question of which class rules in society and of what society we live in. Without that, the whole thing is limited, truncated, cut off from the general political necessity of approaching the question of revolution. That doesn't mean it's easy to bring together those two things, but we have to think about that in everything we're doing. One aspect of that, for example, that's why we sell socialist worker at meetings. So that whatever our comrade she or he is doing, whether they're involved in a campaign around anti-fascism or in defence of the NHS, by selling socialist worker, they're raising something more than simply that campaign. They're raising a much bigger set of political issues. That's one thing about the actuality of revolution. The second is a split from social democracy. A split from the ideas that were around particularly strongly at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, embodied in the German Social Democratic Party and amongst people like Edward Bernstein, one of the leaders of the SPD in Germany, which stressed very much the automatic and inevitable growing over from capitalism towards socialism. That as capitalism developed, it would become more and more social, it would become more and more divorced from private ownership, and that at various points it would become almost an automatic process, an inevitable process, that some form of socialism would be achieved as a result of this. It very much stages theory of history. First of all, you have feudalism. Feudalism grows over into capitalism. Capitalism grows over to socialism on the basis of economic development. Now, Lenin very much stressed a break from that. Nothing was inevitable in terms of historical development. You know, Marx says this in the Communist Manifesto, that you can have class struggles that end up in development of the productive forces and political change, or you can have the common ruin of the contending classes, as Marx puts in the Communist Manifesto. Lenin underlines that and talks about how the necessity of revolutionaries organising. Again, Marx says men and women make history, but not in conditions of their own choosing. In other words, there's an objective element that constrains and conditions what is possible in society. Spartacus could not have raised socialist transformation of society. Why not? Not because Spartacus wasn't a good egg, but because there was not sufficient production in Roman society at the time to give everyone a decent life and so on. That required development of the productive forces, and that constrained Spartacus's thought. So not just anything was possible, but what people do matters. What each of us does conditions the class struggle, makes things possible. And Lenin, the actuality of revolution is also about revolutionary transformation won't just come because history says so. History will roll on and one day we'll wake up and discover actually the class struggle has been abolished, capitalism has become so pleasant and nice now, and we'll all work like Silicon Valley, and everyone can go to work whenever they want and dress as they want, and all the rest of it, and that we'll be under socialism. No, one of the crucial elements of Leninism is it requires the organisation of revolutionaries. This is very, very important. When Lukács talks about the actuality of revolution, I think those two elements in Lenin's thought are incredibly important. They're ones that we wrestle with today. And Lukács goes on to say that the revolutionaries do not have for one moment the task of either making the revolution or by their own actions of sweeping the inactive masses along to confront them with a revolutionary fait accompli. They are, in other words, the tangible embodiment of proletarian class consciousness. I actually have some problems with Lukács's formulation about the tangible, what does he say about it? The tangible embodiment of proletarian class consciousness. I think it's a slightly dangerous formula, which we could discuss if people want to, because I think it slightly suggests that the party involves in itself the ideas, the highest level of ideas of the working class. I think there's some problems with that formula. But nonetheless, the point that Lukács was making is that revolutionaries have to confront those two elements, the need for actual organisation in order to bring about transformation and change, and also the necessity never to forget that a revolution is both possible and necessary in order for society to be transformed. Right. Let's move on to talk quickly through some of the points that are raised by Lenin's writings and what he puts forward as the organisational conclusions of it. Lenin's thought begins in the historical context, important to say it, of the 1860s and the 1870s of Narodnism in Russia. Who were the Narodniks? They were an incredibly heroic group of people, many of them sort of university student types, who went to the people, largely to the peasantry, the most benighted sections of Russian society, barely literate, very low level of culture, very low level of economic development, very, very poor, pressed, that these heroic figures, the Narodniks, could see that this was an appalling society, that these people were the most oppressed and exploited inside it, and therefore that they would heroically go to them in one of two ways. Either they would go and educate them, they would go and speak to the peasantry and make them aware of just how bad their lives were and the necessity to do something about it, or if that seemed a trifle tedious and difficult, terrorism was the solution. If you blew up the Tsar, that would give things a bit of a shake. It would certainly give the Tsar a shake, but it would shake up society. It would say, look, we're chucking a bomb at the Tsar. We're removing the hated symbols of the autocracy, but also we're saying to you, come on, it's time to rise up. Now, the Narodniks were heroic, incredibly heroic and self-sacrificing and so on, no doubt about that, but Lenin's thought was conditioned as a response against Narodnism. You know, famously, Lenin's brother was hung. He was one of the influenced by Narodnik ideas. Lenin's ideas are a way of saying that that's not how we're going to have transformation of society. This is not the way either to have a mass rising of the oppressed and the exploited, nor is it going to transform the control by the ruling class. And in lots of ways you can see this running through Lenin's thought, which is really about, again, two elements. The need for a revolutionary party, but a revolutionary party based in a mass class movement. Really, it seems an obvious thing to say. It's certainly not obvious that both of those elements are required. And you know, even in present-day politics, you can see there's lots of people who, when they're pushed to it, don't agree with one of those two elements. We need a mass movement. The transformation of society cannot be carried through by an elite, whether it be a group of parliamentarians, or a group of heroic fighters, or by terrorism. That can't be done. It requires the active involvement of the masses. Emancipation of the working class is the act of the working class itself, as Marx said. It involves winning over big layers of the working class to a revolutionary understanding in order to transform society. That's element one. That's a reaction against the neuroticism of the elite. Second element is, but come on, that on itself is not enough. We need an organisation that groups together the most advanced and revolutionary workers that can then seek to give leadership to the broader class movement. These two elements were formed very early on in Lenin's thought as a reaction against neuroticism. And they're important really in all the balance between those two moves at various points. But the understanding of that is extremely important. And this is really the basis of Lenin's pamphlet, What is to be Done? Pamphlet's perhaps a bit demeaning of it, it's quite a thick pamphlet, isn't it? Lenin's book, should we say, What is to be Done? Which he wrote in 1903, which lays out some basic understandings. One, I'll go through two first, then one perhaps the most important one. One is the need to overcome narrowness. Economism is what Lenin called it, by which he meant a sort of restriction of the struggle to trade union-y issues, we'd call it now. Simply to talk about the struggle in the factories, simply to talk about wages and conditions and so on. Even though these are crucial, Lenin says it many times in What is to be Done, these questions of the proletariat in the factories, they're absolutely important. But it's not enough to talk about wages and conditions. What we have to talk about is the entire gamut of class relations. Lenin famously says in What is to be Done, the model, the hero of revolutionaries should not be the trade union secretary, but the tribune of the oppressed. Not enough simply to be the best person around the issue of the struggle in your trade union. You also have to take up the question of the religious minorities, the question of women, the question, above all else, of political power and of the autocracy. These are absolutely critical to take up. And you can see that today, can't you, in what we would talk about. Not enough to be the best person at the NUT or the UC or the PCS, I better not mention the board, I don't want to upset anyone. Not enough simply to be the person who raises the issue in your work, about immediate issues of work. You also have to talk about the scapegoating of immigrants, the attacks on LGBT people, the issue of Lucy Meadows, whatever the question may be, you have to raise these as well. Not in a purely formalistic way, but as understanding that this is the building of political consciousness which is necessary. That's one strong theme that runs through his work called What is to be Done. The second is, how are we going to organise as a group of people? As a group of people who have come to this understanding of the necessity for revolutionary organisation. And he talks about professional revolutionaries, about people who will be agents of the organisation, who will be linked together by a paper, a newspaper, which will educate, agitate, organise, will draw them together, and will enable the different parts of the organisation to function as a whole, to be effective in pushing forward a set of ideas that will be capable of drawing in all the different reports from various places and then putting out a way forward for revolutionaries. And actually, I'll come to it later, but when you think about democratic centralism as a method by which revolutionaries organise, full discussion before a decision is made and then united implementation of it, you can see how that's prefigured in lots of ways by this understanding of the necessity for a revolutionary paper and a revolutionary organisation. That it involves both discussion, pulling together everyone's different views, but it also requires an implementation and a guidance about the way forward. The thing about professional revolutionaries is obviously particular. It's not something, I wouldn't argue now that our method is, I suppose I'm a professional revolutionary, it's what I wrote on my census for. But, I wouldn't say that that's it's certainly not our vision of the SWP, of a group of professional revolutionaries. I'm not going to say to you, all of you must leave your jobs and spend all your time being professional revolutionaries. That would be a very foolish thing to suggest. There was a particularity of, the autocracy, the lack of democracy in Russia, the very low level of the revolutionary movement and so on. But what is to be done is very important about this. The third element in what is to be done, as well as the Tribune of the Oppressed and the paper, is the question of consciousness. You see, here Lenin argues that simply through the struggle, you don't come to a full socialist consciousness. You may learn about the boss, you may learn about the media, you may learn about the policeman who hits you over the head, but you don't come to full socialist consciousness. And he stresses this because he wants to break from some of the ideas that are around at the time about saying, if we just concentrate on the struggle, then we'll be all right. People will come to socialist ideas. No, says Lenin, that's not the working class will never achieve socialist consciousness unless it's born from without. From without. By which he suggests, that will need to be the work of the party or intellectuals who will come from without and introduce this. Now, there's an important element of truth in this. In other words, you don't necessarily learn from struggle about the need for socialist transformation and socialist revolution. That's true. But it's also a dangerous formulation from Lenin. I mean, Lenin was arguing about the economism against the narrow people. And he was saying, that's not enough. We need politics. We need to be the tribune of the oppressed. We need to understand consciousness will come from without. It's a dangerous formulation. Well, it's obviously a dangerous formulation for two reasons. One, if you look at history, you can see lots of cases where workers do learn through struggle quite high-level political ideas. The Chartist movement in Britain in the 1840s, for example, brought people through the combination of economic struggle and political struggles to quite a high level of political identity and political understanding, without really the ideas being brought from outside by groups of people. Think of how Marx himself develops his thought. If you look at Capital, Marx writing in the 1860s, the volumes of Capital, actually the question of the United States Civil War is actually quite important in several of the formulations of Marx learning about how historical and economic change comes about through the experience of the 1861-1865 war. How does Marx develop his theory of the state? It is through the Paris Commune of 1871, the first attempt by workers to take over political power and to run a great city like Paris for themselves, to smash the old state and to create a new one. Marx learned that not through sitting in a library, but through the living experience of workers in 1871. And we can talk about lots of other experiences that Lenin could have learned about. There's lots since Lenin died. So, this seems to be very important to understand that we can't simply use this formula that the working class isn't capable of learning in this way. And of course, the great thing is, Lenin himself turns that formula on its head a few years later. Why? Because of the 1905